The morning air along the coast of Maine always carried a certain weight, like the lingering memory of an old conversation. Salt from the Atlantic hung in the mist, mingling with the scent of pine drifting down from the inland hills. For Evelyn Carter, that mix was the smell of home. She stepped out onto the weathered porch of her cedar house, coffee mug warming her hands, and watched the horizon slowly dissolve into daylight. The house itself wasn't much to look at from the road. Paint on the shutters faded to a soft grey, the front steps sagging slightly in the middle. But from where she stood, with the ocean breathing in and out just beyond the dunes, it was perfect. It was hers. And that mattered more than anyone else's opinion. She leaned against the railing, feeling the grain of the wood under her palm, and let the quiet settle around her like an old familiar quilt. In town, people had their theories about Evelyn. Some said she was private, others used words like particular or set in her ways. And then there were the whispers, the ones that floated across diner booths and church potlucks, about how she was too picky or must be lonely. She'd learned to let those words roll off her. People saw what they wanted to see. What they didn't understand was that her life, the way she lived it, wasn't a consolation prize. It was a deliberate choice. This was the part of her story no one ever really asked about. The why. Why would a woman in her early 50s choose to live alone? Why would she seem uninterested in dating apps or setups from well-meaning friends? To most, it didn't make sense. After all, hadn't society promised that happiness came in pairs? But Evelyn had learned something the hard way. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. And for her, solitude was never emptiness. It was space, wide, open space, where she could breathe, think, and grow without shrinking herself to fit someone else's frame. She hadn't always felt that way. There was a time when Evelyn wanted what everyone else seemed to want, or at least what everyone said they wanted. A loving partner, a home filled with laughter, someone to share holidays and quiet Sundays with. She'd come close to it once. Too close, maybe. And that was the thing about almost having something. When it's taken from you, it leaves a mark. The memory still had edges. She'd been 29, engaged to Daniel, her college sweetheart. Their story had all the makings of a sentimental women living alone story's cautionary tale, though she didn't know it yet. They'd met in a freshman literature class, bonding over late-night study sessions and an unspoken belief that they were each other's future. By the time Daniel proposed, Evelyn thought she knew exactly where her life was headed. The invitations were printed, the dress chosen, the seating chart painstakingly arranged, and then, 3 weeks before the wedding, she found out about the other woman. The details came in fragments, a voicemail she wasn't supposed to hear, a receipt crumpled in the pocket of his coat, the sickening clarity that blooms when denial can't hold any more. She remembered sitting on the edge of their bed, dress still hanging in the closet, and realizing she'd been planning a life with someone who had been living a different one all along. After Daniel left, the world felt muted. She moved through her days like a shadow, smiling when expected, nodding when spoken to, but barely present. Friends invited her out, eager to remind her that there was more fish in the sea. She tried. Went on a few polite dinners, endured awkward small talk, but the spark was gone, not just for romance, but for the idea that someone else could complete her. That's not to say she stopped believing in love. She didn't. What she stopped believing was that love should require her to twist herself into shapes that no longer felt natural. The next decade was a slow, winding education in senior women independence. Not because she was a senior then, but because she was learning the same lessons many older women would one day come to know. That self-respect is a higher form of love, and that peace is worth protecting at any cost. Her cedar house became the classroom for those lessons. She bought it at 42 after years of renting small apartments with thin walls and neighbours who fought through the night. The place was a little rundown, the kind of property real estate agents call full of potential, but it spoke to her. She could hear the echo of herself in its empty rooms. Could see the way sunlight would stretch across the floorboards in the morning. Could imagine evenings with the fire crackling while the wind rattled the windows. Fixing it up wasn't easy. She learned to sand floors until her shoulders ached, to replace rotted boards on the porch, to paint with slow, steady strokes. She discovered muscles she didn't know she had, both in her body and in her spirit. Neighbours would stop by sometimes, offering advice or spare tools. Some hinted, kindly or not, that a house like this was too much work for one woman. Evelyn would smile, thank them, and go right back to her project. The truth was, the work grounded her. Every nail hammered, every coat of paint applied, every flower bed planted was a declaration. I can build my own life. This wasn't just home improvement, it was self-restoration. She began to settle into a rhythm. Mornings started with coffee on the porch, watching gulls circle above the dunes. Afternoons might be spent in town, picking up fresh bread from the bakery or chatting with the librarian about new arrivals. Evenings were hers entirely. Sometimes a good book. Sometimes a walk along the shoreline until the sky turned lavender. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a quiet life, maybe even a small one. But Evelyn knew better. Every choice she made was a stitch in the fabric of her freedom. And that freedom, the kind that comes from being whole on your own, was richer than anything she'd traded it for in the past. Still, solitude isn't without its tests. There were nights when the wind howled so loud through the eaves that the house seemed to breathe, and in those moments, she'd feel the absence of another heartbeat in the room. She'd think about how easy it would be to pick up the phone, to call someone just for company. But she also knew that comfort, borrowed out of loneliness, rarely leads anywhere good. So she learned to sit with the silence, to let it teach her rather than frighten her. That was the beginning of what she would later understand as her own senior empowerment tale, though she wasn't a senior yet. It was the start of a long, deep conversation between her and herself, one that would shape the years to come in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The tides outside her door came and went, seasons rolled over the hills, and Evelyn Carter began to write a new kind of love story. One where the first chapter was about loving the person she saw in the mirror each morning. The years after Daniel left weren't marked by any dramatic events, no grand declarations or cinematic scenes of reinvention. They were quieter than that, and in many ways, harder. Quiet has a way of amplifying everything you've been trying to avoid. Evelyn found that out one grey November afternoon, standing in line at the grocery store, watching an older couple ahead of her bicker gently about what kind of bread to buy. She didn't feel jealousy exactly, but there was a pang, the kind that comes from remembering something you once wanted, and realizing it's no longer yours to claim in the same way. She dated a little. There was Mark, who worked at the hardware store and always smelled faintly of cedar. For a while, they went to Thursday night trivia at the pub, laughing over answers they both got wrong. But Mark wanted to spend every weekend fishing with his buddies, and Evelyn noticed how he never really asked about her projects at home. Then came Paul, an English teacher who could quote Shakespeare at will and made her feel like she'd stepped into a different world. But with him, she felt the subtle weight of expectation, that she should be more social, more charming at gatherings, more like the kind of partner people envied. It was in these relationships, short-lived as they were, that Evelyn began to notice a pattern. She would start out as herself, open, steady, full of her own plans, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she would start to shrink. It was in the way she'd skip a hike to spend the day doing what they wanted, or in the way she'd soften her opinions to keep the peace. It wasn't always intentional. Sometimes it was just easier. But easy has a cost, and Evelyn was starting to understand that. One night, after ending things with Paul, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold and thought about the women she'd known over the years. So many had stayed in relationships because it seemed better than the alternative, because the idea of elderly solo living carried too much stigma. She could see it in their faces, the way some of them had dimmed over time, trading pieces of themselves for a sense of belonging that never quite fit. She didn't judge them. If anything, she understood the pull of it. But she also knew that wasn't the life she wanted. It wasn't an overnight transformation. If anything, it was a slow unravelling of the old narrative she'd carried since she was young, that a woman's life reached its full worth when she was part of a couple. She remembered her mother's voice, gentle but firm, telling her at 21, "Don't wait too long to settle down, Evie. It gets harder the older you get. She remembered how at family gatherings, questions about her career faded quickly, replaced by the inevitable, "So, are you seeing anyone?" By her late 30s, she had stopped giving long explanations. A simple "not right now" sufficed, even when she could feel the unspoken concern in the air. But inside, something was shifting. She started to imagine a different kind of life, one that didn't hinge on whether she found the right person. She thought about how much space she'd have, literal and emotional, to explore what mattered to her without having to negotiate every decision. That vision grew stronger the year she turned 40. She took a solo trip to Vermont in the fall, renting a small cabin near a lake. The mornings were cold enough that she could see her breath as she walked along the shoreline, the trees blazing in shades of red and gold. She cooked simple meals, read by the fire, and went days without speaking to anyone except the innkeeper. And instead of feeling lonely, she felt something she hadn't in years: peace. On the last day of that trip, she stood on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the still water, and made herself a quiet promise. "I'm not going to chase any more," she whispered. "If love comes, it comes, but I'm not bending myself out of shape to find it." When she returned home, the cedar house waiting for her, she began to act on that promise. She poured more of herself into her surroundings, repainting the kitchen cabinets, planting lavender along the front walk, building a small reading nook under the window in her bedroom. Neighbours would stop by, curious about her progress, sometimes offering unsolicited advice about how a man could help with that. Evelyn would just smile, her paint-speckled hands resting on her hips, and say, "I've got it covered." She started finding joy in the little rituals that filled her days. On Saturday, some nights when the moon hung low over the water, she'd think about the road ahead. She didn't know what her life would look like at 60 or 70, but she began to picture a version of herself as one of those active aging women she admired. Strong, self-sufficient, still curious about the world. She liked the idea that her story could be one of those inspirational senior stories that younger women might hear one day, proof that there's more than one way to live a good life. Of course, the world didn't entirely let her be. There were still the sidelong glances at weddings when she arrived alone, the pitying comments at holiday dinners, the occasional well-meaning but misguided attempt to set her up with a nice guy. Evelyn had learned to navigate these moments with grace, offering a polite laugh or a change of subject. But privately, she held on to her promise. And then came the spring when Mia knocked on her door, a moment that would shift Evelyn's life again, this time in ways she hadn't planned. But that was still ahead. For now she was content in the life she was building, piece by piece, like the house she'd restored. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And for Evelyn Carter, that was enough. It was one of those March evenings when the air can't decide if it wants to be rain or snow. The wind carried a damp chill that slipped through even the thickest coat, and the Atlantic's restless waves pounded the shore as if trying to climb higher with each push. Evelyn had been reading by the fire, her slippers propped on the old oak footstool, the smell of wood smoke filling the room. Outside, the day's light had faded into a slate-grey dusk, and the house felt wrapped in its own cocoon of warmth. That was when she heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. It startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Visitors to her cedar house usually came in the daylight, often announced by the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. But now, with the wind rattling the eaves and the last of the fire's embers shifting softly, those knocks sounded urgent. When she opened the door, the first thing she saw was the suitcase, scuffed, wet, and heavy-looking. Then her eyes met the face above it. Mia. Evelyn knew her by sight. The young woman lived 2 doors down in a small cottage with bright blue shutters that stood out against the grey and brown of the coastal neighbourhood. They'd exchanged polite greetings in passing, in the grocery store or aisle at the farmer's market, but nothing beyond that. Now, Mia's hair was plastered to her cheeks, rainwater dripping down her coat. Her eyes were red, not from the wind, but from tears that hadn't yet fully stopped. "I'm sorry to bother you," Mia began, her voice thin and frayed, but I didn't know where else to go. She shifted the suitcase, her fingers pale from the cold. "Could I stay here tonight?" just for tonight." There was no hesitation in Evelyn's answer. "Of course, come in." The warmth of the living room wrapped around them as Evelyn shut the door behind her. She took the suitcase from Mia and set it by the stairs, then led her to the armchair nearest the fire. The old wool blanket that Evelyn kept draped over the back of the couch soon found its way around Mia's shoulders. "I'll put on some tea," Evelyn said, moving toward the kitchen. She didn't ask questions right away. She knew from her own experience that sometimes the first kindness you can offer is space. When she returned, Mia was staring into the fire as if trying to memorize it. The steam from the chamomile tea curled upward, carrying the scent of honey. It wasn't until Mia had taken a few sips that the words began to come. "It's not what I thought it would be," she said finally, her eyes still fixed on the flames. "We met last summer. He was charming, funny. He said all the right things. I thought." She stopped, the tea trembling slightly in her hands. "But somewhere along the way I stopped recognizing myself. Everything I did was wrong. I wasn't enough, or I was too much, and I kept telling myself it would get better." Evelyn listened, nodding gently, letting Mia fill the spaces between sentences with her own pauses. She heard the familiar beats, the early rush of affection, the subtle shifts into criticism, the erosion of self-worth disguised as love. She'd never lived Mia's exact story, but she knew its outlines like a map she'd once travelled herself. "I left tonight," Mia continued. "I don't even know if I have a plan. I couldn't stay one more minute." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes. "You don't need a plan right now," Evelyn said softly. "You just need a place to rest." She showed Mia to the guest room, a small, cosy space at the back of the house with a quilt Evelyn had sewn years ago. The rain tapped steadily against the window as they settled in. Evelyn left a lamp on low and a glass of water on the nightstand. Standing in the hallway afterward, Evelyn felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. This wasn't just about offering a bed for the night. She knew, instinctively, that something bigger had crossed her threshold. That night, as she banked the fire and turned off the lights, Evelyn thought about the strange ways lives intersect. She'd been content in her solitude, her elderly solo, living a choice she protected fiercely. But sometimes independence wasn't about keeping everyone out. Sometimes it was about knowing when to let someone in. In her own quiet way, Evelyn understood the unspoken courage it took for Mia to show up at her door. Courage wasn't always loud or defiant. Sometimes it looked like a young woman, soaked to the bone, standing in the rain with nothing but a suitcase and the will to leave. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed in that clean, cold light only the Maine coast seems to know. The sky was a fragile blue, the air crisp enough to make each breath feel like it was clearing something old from your lungs. Evelyn was already in the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee curling through the house when she heard the soft creak of the guest room door. Mia appeared in the doorway, hair pulled back in a messy braid, wearing the oversized sweatshirt Evelyn had left folded at the foot of the bed. She looked younger in the daylight and more exhausted. "I hope you slept a little," Evelyn said, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "A little," Mia replied, managing a faint smile. She wrapped her hands around the mug as if borrowing its warmth. "Thank you for last night. I don't think I've ever just shown up at someone's house like that." "You did what you needed to do," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "That's not something to apologize for." They sat at the small pine table by the window, sunlight spilling across the wood, catching the steam rising from their cups. At first, their conversation stayed in safe waters, the weather, the bakery in town, the way the gulls seemed to grow bolder every spring. But slowly, as though testing the strength of each word before she released it, Mia began to speak about the man she'd left. She didn't give him a name at first, just called him he, and Evelyn didn't push for more. The details that did come were enough. The isolation, friends she stopped seeing, hobbies she abandoned. The way his criticism started small, wrapped in jokes, then sharpened over time. The nights she lay awake, trying to remember the last time she'd felt like herself. "It's funny," Mia said at one point, eyes fixed on the rim of her cup. "I used to think women who lived alone were sad. Lonely. Like they'd failed somehow. But last night, walking up your driveway, I realized I was the one who was lonely, and I wasn't even alone. Evelyn felt the truth of that settle between them like a shared secret. She'd heard variations of it before, from other women who eventually saw that companionship without respect isn't really companionship at all. Over the next few days, Evelyn didn't try to map out Mia's future. Instead, she focused on the immediate. She drove her into Portland to meet with a counsellor at a women's advocacy centre, sitting quietly in the waiting room with a book. She helped Mia pick up essentials she'd left behind, warm clothes, a sturdy pair of boots, and connected her with a local group that offered free legal advice for situations like hers. In the evenings, they'd share simple meals, vegetable soup, thick slices of bread, and sometimes watch old movies. Other nights, they'd talk until the fire burned down to embers. Mia would tell a story from her childhood, and Evelyn would counter with one of her own, weaving an invisible thread of trust between them. It wasn't about rescuing her. Evelyn knew better than to think she could. This was about reminding Mia she had the strength to rescue herself. One night, after a long silence, Mia said quietly, "You saved me." Evelyn shook her head. "No, I just opened the door. You're the one who walked through." Mia didn't answer, but her eyes softened in a way that told Evelyn the words had landed. Outside, spring was beginning to stir, the first crocuses pushing through the thawed earth, the air carrying a faint hint of salt and new growth. Evelyn found herself thinking about how quickly life could shift. One moment you're alone by the fire, the next you're making space for someone else's storm. It reminded her of something she'd once read. Sometimes independence isn't about standing apart from everyone, but about standing steady enough to hold someone else up when they falter. She realized this, here, now, was part of her own senior empowerment tale, even if she hadn't planned for it. In helping Mia, Evelyn was reminded of an old truth she'd carried for years but hadn't needed to use lately. That the strength you build in solitude is the same strength that allows you to be there for someone without losing yourself. And though she didn't say it out loud, she was grateful for the reminder. April came in quietly that year, as if it didn't want to startle anyone. The days were still cool, but the harsh bite of winter had softened, and the sound of the ocean had shifted from a restless roar to a calmer, rhythmic pulse. Evelyn noticed these changes the way some people notice the pages of a calendar turning, not with dates and numbers, but with the subtle shift of light through the windows, the different angle of shadows across the porch in the late afternoon. Mia was still staying in the guest room, though now her suitcase sat open and neatly organized, instead of hunched in the corner like a refugee. There was a new steadiness in the way she moved around the house, the way she'd hum quietly while making tea, or the way she laughed, lightly, almost surprised, when Evelyn told a dry joke over breakfast. One morning they drove into town together to pick up groceries. The sky was that perfect shade of blue that comes only after a night of rain, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and cedar. As they walked past the storefronts, the bakery with its warm, yeasty air, the hardware store with its display of rakes and seed packets, Evelyn caught Mia glancing at her with a look she couldn't quite read. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, pausing outside the post office. Mia hesitated, then said, "You just seem so at ease here, like you know exactly where you belong." Evelyn thought about that as they continued walking. Belonging, she'd learned, wasn't about the approval of others or fitting into a particular role. It was about knowing yourself well enough to stand still when the world tried to push you in a different direction. That afternoon, back at the house, they sat on the porch with mugs of tea, watching the gulls wheel above the water. Mia asked about the early days in the Cedar House, the repairs, the long nights alone, the comments from neighbours who couldn't imagine why she'd take it on by herself. Evelyn told her the truth, that it had been both harder and more rewarding than she could have explained at the time. "There were nights," she said, "when the wind would rattle the windows and I'd wonder if I'd made a mistake. But then I'd wake up in the morning, see the light coming in, smell the coffee brewing, and I'd think, no, this is mine. Every board, every nail, every choice, mine." Mia was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want that. Not this house exactly, just that feeling of being in a place, in a life, that's yours." Evelyn smiled. "You can have it. It just takes time, and the willingness to not settle for less than you deserve." They didn't speak for a while after that. The conversation drifted into the comfortable silence that comes from being with someone who understands your pauses. The ocean rolled in and out. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Later that week, Mia started making small changes in her own routine. She walked into town alone one morning, came back with a bag from the bookstore and a cinnamon roll from the bakery. She joined Evelyn in the garden, kneeling in the dirt to help plant early lettuce and peas. In the evening, she'd sometimes sit at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing in long, looping script. Evelyn didn't ask what she was writing. She figured it was enough that Mia was finding a voice again, even if she was only speaking it to herself for now. There was something quietly remarkable about watching another person reclaim their space in the world. It reminded Evelyn of her own journey, the long process of stripping away what didn't belong, until what was left was hers alone. It was a living reminder of why she'd chosen the path she had, why her elderly solo living wasn't a retreat from life, but a way of fully inhabiting it. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Mia said, "You know, I used to think independence was just being able to pay your bills and take care of yourself. But it's more than that, isn't it?" "It is," Evelyn said, drying a plate. "It's also about knowing you can be okay with your own company, and not letting anyone convince you that being on your own means you're incomplete." Mia nodded slowly, as if storing the words somewhere important. By the time the first warm days of May arrived, the rhythm of the house had shifted again. It was still Evelyn's sanctuary, but now it carried a lighter energy, a shared one. The air was filled with the smell of lilacs from the bushes near the porch, the sound of the screen door opening and closing as they moved in and out. And though Evelyn still valued her solitude, she realized she also valued this. The unexpected companionship that didn't demand she be anything other than herself. June crept in with long days and the kind of light that lingers well past supper, casting everything in a warm, honey-coloured glow. The lilacs had faded, replaced by wild roses climbing along the edge of the dunes, their petals drifting onto the sand like confetti from some quiet celebration. Mia had been living with Evelyn for almost 3 months now, and though her suitcase still sat in the guest room, it was no longer a symbol of flight. It had become a symbol of transition, a reminder that she'd made a choice to leave and that she was still making choices about where to go next. One morning, Evelyn found her at the kitchen table, laptop open, a yellow legal pad covered in lists. "I'm looking at apartments," Mia said, glancing up with a mixture of excitement and nerves. "I'm not ready to go too far yet, but I think I'm ready to have my own space." Evelyn poured coffee and sat down across from her. "That's good," she said simply. She didn't make it a big moment. She didn't need to. She knew this decision had been building slowly, like the tide rising under a calm surface. The next few weeks were filled with small but significant milestones. Mia met with a realtor. She toured a handful of places, some too expensive, some too dark, one with a balcony that overlooked the harbour and seemed to catch her breath. She started a part-time job at the local bookstore, returning in the evening smelling faintly of paper and coffee from the attached cafe. Evelyn watched all of it with quiet pride. She didn't hover, didn't try to direct Mia's path. Her role was more like the steady post a young tree is tied to, there to offer support until the trunk is strong enough to stand on its own. But as Mia's independence grew, Evelyn found herself reflecting on her own journey. She remembered the early days after buying the Cedar House, the way every task felt like both a burden and a triumph. She remembered the first winter she spent there alone, how she learned to build a fire that would last through the night, how she shoveled her own driveway while the neighbours watched from behind frosted windows. Back then, she'd thought independence was about survival, about proving she could manage without leaning on anyone. Now, watching Maya's steps toward a new life, she realised it was more than that. True senior women independence wasn't just about the ability to stand alone. It was about the freedom to choose when and how to let others in. One evening, as the sun slipped low over the water, they sat on the porch with glasses of iced tea. The air was soft and smelled faintly of the sea. Mia leaned back in her chair and said, "I used to think women like you, women who live alone, had given up on love." She glanced at Evelyn, her expression open, unguarded. "But now I see it's not about giving up. It's about not giving yourself away to the wrong person." Evelyn smiled. "Exactly. It's not that we don't want love. We just want the kind that doesn't require us to disappear in order to keep it." Mia nodded, sipping her tea. "I hope I can get there someday." "You will," Evelyn said, her voice certain. "You're already on your way." The conversation drifted to other things, recipes, books, the summer events happening in town, but that moment stayed with Evelyn. It reminded her that her life, her choices, were more than just personal decisions. They were part of a larger tapestry of senior empowerment tales, stories that could quietly shift how younger women saw their own possibilities. Later that night, after Mia had gone to bed, Evelyn stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit water. She thought about how her elderly solo living had begun as an act of self-preservation, but had grown into something richer. A way of living that not only nourished her own spirit, but also created space for others to find theirs. And in that stillness, she realized something else. Sometimes the most powerful influence comes not from teaching or preaching, but from simply living in a way that shows another person what's possible. By mid-July, the days were heavy with heat, the kind that made the horizon shimmer where the sea met the sky. Evelyn kept the windows open, letting the salt air drift through the rooms, carrying the faint cries of gulls and the sound of waves folding over themselves on the shore. The garden was in full bloom now, lavender spilling over its borders, tomatoes just beginning to blush red. It was during one of those warm afternoons that Mia came home from work, a folded lease agreement in her hand and a smile that was equal parts excitement and apprehension. "I found a place," she said, handing Evelyn the paper. It was the small apartment with the balcony overlooking the harbour, the one she'd liked weeks ago, but hadn't thought she could afford. As it turned out, the landlord had been willing to negotiate. They spent the next few weeks gathering what Mia would need, some pieces bought second-hand, others donated by neighbours who'd quietly taken note of her journey. Evelyn offered a few things of her own. An old quilt she'd made years ago, a sturdy wooden chair with just the right curve in its back, a ceramic teapot shaped like a lighthouse. Moving day arrived one of those bright, unhurried mornings that summer seems to specialise in. They loaded Evelyn's truck with boxes and drove the short distance into town, windows down, hair blowing in the wind. At the apartment, they carried everything up the narrow stairs, setting boxes against bare walls, arranging furniture in a space that already seemed to breathe easier now that Mia was in it. When the last box was inside, they stood on the balcony together, looking out at the boats bobbing in the harbour. The air was thick with the smell of the tide going out, mingled with the faint scent of frying fish from a cafe down the street. "You did this," Evelyn said quietly. "Every step, you did it." Mia smiled, but there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "I couldn't have without you." "You could have," Evelyn said, meeting her gaze, "but I'm glad I got to see you do it." They hugged, not the quick, polite kind, but the kind that lingers because both people know something is ending and beginning at the same time. Then Evelyn left, letting Mia settle into her new space without the shadow of a guest still in her doorway. Driving home, Evelyn felt the familiar quiet of the cedar house wrap around her. It was different now, though. For months, her days had carried the sound of another voice, the presence of someone moving through the same rooms. Now it was just her again, and the echo of footsteps that no longer crossed the floor. That first evening, she moved through her routines, watering the garden, making a simple dinner, reading in her favourite chair, but found herself pausing in small ways. She caught herself setting out 2 mugs instead of 1, glancing toward the guest room as if expecting to see a light on. Yet beneath the faint ache of absence was something steady, something that felt like pride. Mia was out there in the world, standing on her own, and Evelyn had been a small part of that. This, she realized, was one of those inspirational senior stories she'd admired in others, the kind where you live your truth so fully that it quietly gives someone else permission to do the same. Later that night, she stepped out onto her own porch, the air cooling as the day released its heat. The stars were sharp in the dark sky, the ocean a soft, endless hush beyond the dunes. She thought about how her senior women independence had never been about shutting the world out. It had always been about protecting the space in which she could truly be herself. And now, she saw, it could also be about lending that space to someone else until they found their own. She stayed out there a long time, listening to the night settle around her, feeling the kind of peace that isn't loud or triumphant, but deep and quiet, the kind that's... Late August brought the annual Carter family gathering, an event that had been happening for as long as Evelyn could remember. It was held at her cousin Laura's sprawling farmhouse inland, miles from the ocean, but full of its own charm. Fields rolling out behind the barn, long picnic tables under the shade of old maple trees, the air buzzing with cicadas in the heat of the afternoon. Evelyn had skipped a few of these in recent years, citing home repairs or community events, but this year she decided to go. Part of her wanted to see familiar faces, to catch up on the new babies and the college graduations, the stories of gardens and vacations. Part of her simply knew that staying away forever would only feed the assumptions some relatives already had about her. She arrived with a homemade blueberry pie, its crust golden and still warm, the scent mingling with the smoky aroma from the barbecue pit. Hugs and greetings met her at every turn, but she could feel the undercurrent she knew so well. The curious glances, the subtle tilt of heads when they asked, "So, what's new with you?" For most of the afternoon she moved easily through conversations, sharing updates about her garden, the restoration projects she'd been working on at the house, and a few stories about helping her neighbour, without going into detail. She laughed at the children's races across the lawn, admired the patchwork of quilts someone had hung along the fence for display, and refilled iced tea glasses when she passed by. It wasn't until dinner was winding down that the inevitable question came. Laura, always direct, leaned across the table and said with a half-smile, "You know, Evie, you're not getting any younger. Don't you ever get lonely out there by yourself?" The conversation around them slowed just enough for Evelyn to notice. She felt the weight of a few pairs of eyes turning her way, waiting for her answer. She didn't rush. She set down her fork, folded her hands in her lap, and met Laura's gaze with the kind of calm that comes from knowing your truth so well it doesn't need defending. "Lonely?" Evelyn said, her voice even. "Sometimes, sure, but I'd rather have a few honest moments of loneliness than spend years with the wrong person, feeling like I'm disappearing a little at a time." A murmur passed down the table, the kind that wasn't quite agreement but wasn't disapproval either, more like the quiet shift when someone realizes they've been handed a perspective they hadn't considered. Laura's smile faltered just slightly, but she didn't push. "Well," she said, lifting her glass, "as long as you're happy." "I am," Evelyn said simply, returning the gesture. The subject moved on, but the exchange lingered in Evelyn's mind on the drive home. She thought about how many times over the years she'd been asked to justify her choices, how often she'd felt the need to soften her answers so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. Not anymore. At this stage in her life, as one of those active aging women she admired, her answers were no longer crafted to please. They were simply the truth. Back at the Cedar House, she set the empty pie dish in the sink and stepped onto the porch. The air was cooler now, the first hints of autumn threading through the late summer warmth. Out beyond the dunes, the ocean caught the moonlight in shifting silver bands. She thought of Mia in her Harbourview apartment, starting her new chapter, and smiled. They were two women at different points in their journeys, yet bound by the same quiet understanding. Independence isn't about rejecting love, but about refusing to trade away the self for it. And as she stood there, the night sounds rising around her, Evelyn felt a small but certain satisfaction. She wasn't living anyone else's version of success. She was living her own, a story that, to the right person, might be as much a guide as it was a life. By the time September tilted into October, the days had grown shorter, and the air along the main coast carried that crisp edge that hinted at the first frost. The ocean's blue deepened into steel, and the gulls seemed to fly lower, closer to the water, as though conserving their strength for the colder months ahead. Evelyn felt the seasons shift in her bones, not as a heaviness, but as a kind of steadying. Autumn always brought her back to herself. Her routines adjusted with the season. She spent more time indoors, tending to small projects she'd set aside during the busy summer months. She began stacking firewood along the side of the house, the smell of split pine lingering on her gloves. In the evenings, she'd simmer soups on the stove, the steam fogging the kitchen windows while wind rattled the branches outside. One rainy afternoon, she sat at the old desk in her bedroom, writing a letter to a friend she hadn't seen in years. The pen moved slowly, each word chosen with care. She wrote about the garden's last harvest, about a new trail she'd discovered on a morning walk, about the quiet pride she felt watching Mia settle into her own place. But as she wrote, she realized she was also writing to herself. A record of how far she'd come, a reminder that her senior women independence was not just survival, but a form of abundance. It struck her how many chapters of her life had been written without fanfare, without witnesses, yet still carried the weight of transformation. The decision to buy the cedar house, the first winter she made it through alone, the moment she'd opened her door to Mia. None of it had. The weather turned again in mid-October, a nor'easter sweeping in from the Atlantic. The wind howled around the corners of the house, and waves pounded the shore hard enough to be heard even from the porch. Evelyn spent that day inside, the fire crackling in the hearth, a blanket across her lap. She thought about how storms used to make her nervous when she first moved in, the way they reminded her she was the only one there to face whatever came. Now, they made her feel something different, capable, grounded. One evening between storms, she drove into town to pick up a few groceries. She ran into a younger woman she recognized from the library, someone she'd seen once or twice but never spoken to. They exchanged polite greetings, and as Evelyn was about to move on, the woman hesitated. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," she began, "but I think it's inspiring, the way you live. I've heard people talk about how you fixed up that old house yourself, and, well, I just wanted to say, it makes me feel like I don't have to rush into things I'm not sure about." Evelyn thanked her, a little surprised by the sudden rush of warmth she felt. It was one thing to live your life on your own terms. It was another to see that life quietly ripple outward, touching someone else's choices. It reminded her of something she'd thought the night Mia moved out, that sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't what you give people directly, but the example you leave for them to follow if they choose. That night, she stood on her porch long after the groceries were put away, the air sharp in her lungs. The moon was nearly full, throwing a path of silver across the water. She thought about how the world often framed elderly solo living as an ending, when to her it had always been a beginning. A space where she could keep becoming herself, season after season, without compromise. And as the wind lifted off the ocean and wrapped around her, she knew the final truth she wanted to carry into the next chapter. She hadn't built this life to prove anything to anyone. She had built it because it was the truest way she knew to live.